Every time a war begins, governments tell the same story. They say the conflict is necessary. They say the nation must defend itself. They say sacrifices must be made. But there's one question almost nobody asks. Where does the money come from? Wars cost unimaginable amounts of money. Modern conflicts burn through billions of dollars every single week. Tanks, aircraft, missiles, logistics, intelligence systems, military salaries, reconstruction costs, the list never ends. Yet here's the strange part. Most countries do not have that money when a war begins. Governments don't suddenly discover a giant savings account hidden somewhere. Instead, something else happens, something far less visible but far more powerful. They borrow, and once that borrowing starts, something even more surprising happens. War ends, but the debt never does. In fact, the debt usually grows even faster after the war is over. This pattern has repeated for centuries, and behind it lies a financial system that quietly transforms every major conflict into something else entirely, a permanent expansion of government debt. To understand how this works, we have to go back to the beginning of modern finance. The origins. How war and debt became connected. The connection between war and borrowing did not always exist. In ancient times, wars were usually funded in simple ways. Kings used treasure reserves, raised taxes, or seized wealth from conquered territories. But wars kept getting larger. Armies grew bigger. Weapons became more complex. Logistics became more expensive. Eventually, rulers faced a problem. They needed more money than their kingdoms actually had. This led to a revolutionary idea. Instead of paying for wars immediately, governments could borrow money and promise to repay it later. One of the earliest large-scale examples appeared in 17th century Europe. Governments began issuing government bonds, essentially IOUs sold to investors. Investors would lend money to the government today. The government would promise to repay them later, with interest. At first, this seemed like a clever solution. Wars could be financed quickly, armies could be mobilized immediately. Governments could spread the cost across many years. But a deeper transformation had quietly begun. War was no longer limited by the money a nation possessed. It was now limited only by how much it could borrow. The banking system enters the war machine. As borrowing expanded, another powerful institution became central to the process. Banks quickly realized something important. Governments were some of the largest and most reliable borrowers in the world. Unlike private businesses, governments could always collect taxes. That meant they were very unlikely to default. This made government debt extremely attractive. Over time, entire financial markets developed around buying and selling government bonds. Then came a second transformation: central banks. Central banks were created to stabilize financial systems, manage currency supply, and support government finances during crises, and wars were the biggest crises of all. During major conflicts, central banks often stepped in to purchase government bonds directly or indirectly, injecting massive amounts of money into the system. This meant governments could borrow even more. Wars grew larger, military spending exploded, and national debt expanded at historic levels. But the real turning point arrived in the 20th century. The breaking point, the World Wars. Nothing accelerated the war debt system more dramatically than the two world wars. World War I shattered previous limits on government borrowing. Countries issued enormous amounts of debt to fund weapons production, soldiers, and supply chains. By the end of the war, many nations had accumulated debts that would take generations to repay. Then came World War II. The scale was even larger. The United States, Britain, Germany, Japan, and the Soviet Union all mobilized entire economies for war. Factories converted into weapons production centers. Governments borrowed at unprecedented levels. Central banks played a crucial role in financing these efforts. The result: global government debt surged to levels never seen before in human history. But here's the part most people overlook. When the wars ended, the borrowing didn't stop. Instead, the debt simply became part of the financial system. Governments rolled old debt into new debt. Bonds matured and were replaced with new bonds. Interest payments continued year after year. The war ended, but the debt system continued expanding. The fallout, a permanent debt machine by the late 20th century, something remarkable had happened. Government debt was no longer just a temporary tool for wartime emergencies. It had become a permanent feature of modern economies. Every year, governments borrowed more. Some of that borrowing funded infrastructure, social programs, or economic stimulus. But wars and military spending remained one of the largest drivers of debt expansion. Modern wars are incredibly expensive. The United States alone has spent trillions of dollars on overseas conflicts over the past few decades. Those costs were largely financed through borrowing, which means the financial consequences will continue for decades. Interest payments accumulate, old debt rolls into new debt, and future taxpayers inherit the obligations. In other words, the financial impact of war doesn't end when the fighting stops. It continues quietly inside national budgets for generations. Failed fixes, attempts to break the cycle over time. Economists and policymakers have tried to solve the problem. Some proposed balanced budget rules to limit borrowing. Others suggested higher wartime taxes so citizens would feel the immediate cost of conflict. A few even proposed constitutional limits on government debt. But these solutions rarely last. Why? Because borrowing is politically easier than raising taxes. During wartime, governments want to mobilize resources quickly without triggering public backlash. Debt allows them to do exactly that. The costs are simply pushed into the future. And the future, of course, always arrives later. Modern parallels. The pattern continues today, the pattern still repeats. Military spending remains one of the largest components of government budgets in many countries. Conflicts in various regions of the world continue to generate enormous financial costs, and most of those costs are financed the same way they have been for centuries, through borrowing. Global government debt has now reached tens of trillions of dollars. Much of that debt accumulated during periods of crisis, wars, financial collapses, and economic emergencies. Each crisis adds another layer. Each layer increases the total. And once the debt exists, it rarely disappears. Instead, it becomes part of the structure of the global financial system. 3 takeaways. So what does this hidden system actually reveal? First, modern wars are not only military events, they are financial events. Borrowing is often the primary mechanism that allows large-scale conflicts to occur. Second, government debt rarely disappears after wars end. It usually becomes permanent, passed from one generation of taxpayers to the next. Third, the financial architecture supporting war has become deeply embedded in the global economy, linking governments, banks, and financial markets in a continuous cycle. Final thought: war ends when peace treaties are signed. But the financial consequences can last for decades, sometimes centuries. Every bond issued during conflict becomes a promise about the future, a promise that someone, someday, will repay. And that raises one final question worth thinking about. If wars keep expanding government debt, and governments keep borrowing to manage that debt, how long can the system continue before something finally breaks? Call to action. If you found this story interesting, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden systems behind money, debt, and global finance. Because sometimes the most powerful forces shaping history are not the battles we see, but the financial systems operating quietly behind them.